Genghis Khan wasn't afraid of armies, kings, or death. But there was one man who made even Genghis Khan feel fear.
Listen, this is Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu. And honestly, he's one of the most underestimated warriors in history. I mean, a man who achieved what no one else could. He defeated the Mongol war machine and sent Genghis Khan's forces fleeing in terror. Can you believe it? At just 25 years old, 25, whilst leading a crumbling empire on the brink of total destruction, this forgotten prince, this incredible warrior, orchestrated the most humiliating military defeat in Mongol history.
We're talking about a victory so shocking that it sparked rebellions across the known world and made the great Khan himself admit he'd met his match. And boy, did he enjoy that brief moment of triumph. But here's the crucial part, and this is important. This wasn't just any victory. This was the Battle of Parwan in 1221, where Jalal ad-Din personally charged into Mongol ranks and did something that seemed absolutely impossible. He made them run. Little did anyone know that this single battle would haunt Genghis Khan for the rest of his life and change the course of the Mongol expansion forever. But listen to this. How does a prince from a dying dynasty end up becoming the only man Genghis Khan refused to face in single combat? Welcome to the insane true story of Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, the forgotten nightmare who proved that even the great Khan could bleed. Now, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu was born around 1199 into the Khwarezmian Empire, and let me tell you, one of the most powerful Islamic dynasties of the 13th century. His father, Ala ad-Din Atsiz, ruled over vast territories stretching from modern-day Iran to Afghanistan, controlling crucial trade routes that connected east and west. You see, the Khwarezmian Empire wasn't just rich. It was stupidly rich, controlling the Silk Road and taxing merchants who moved goods between China and Europe. But wealth, as Jalal ad-Din would later learn the hard way, could be both a blessing and a curse. From an early age, young Jalal ad-Din showed signs of the military genius that would later terrify the Mongols. His tutors noted his exceptional skills in horsemanship and swordsmanship, but what really set him apart, what made him special, was his tactical mind. While other princes played games, Jalal ad-Din studied military formations and siege warfare. It was an early lesson for Jalal ad-Din that power without strategy meant absolutely nothing. The truth is, he grew up in a world where survival depended on your ability to outthink and outfight your enemies, and he absorbed these lessons like a sponge. What's really interesting, though, is how the political landscape was shifting during Jalal ad-Din's youth. By the time he reached his teens, rumors were spreading about a mysterious warlord emerging from the Mongolian steppes, a man who united the warring tribes under one banner. At first, nobody took these stories seriously. I mean, after all, what could nomadic herders possibly do against the established empires of the civilized world? Jalal ad-Din would later reflect on this period and say that the greatest mistake rulers make is underestimating their enemies. He watched as his father dismissed the Mongol threat, focusing instead on internal politics and palace intrigue. But the young prince was paying attention. He studied reports from merchants and travelers, piecing together a picture of Mongol military tactics that others ignored. Little did his father know that this curiosity would one day save what remained of their empire. In 1220, when Jalal ad-Din was just 21 years old, the storm finally reached his doorstep. Genghis Khan's massive army swept into Khwarezm like a biblical plague, destroying everything in its path. City after city fell to the Mongol war machine, and Jalal ad-Din watched helplessly as his world crumbled around him. His father fled west, eventually dying in exile, leaving the young prince to face an impossible situation. The Mongols had already conquered kingdoms from China to Persia, and their reputation for brutality preceded them everywhere they went. Entire populations were massacred, cities were razed to the ground, and resistance seemed futile. But here's where Jalal ad-Din's character truly emerges, and this is what makes him incredible. Instead of fleeing like his father, he chose to fight. Using the connections he'd built during his youth, Jalal ad-Din began gathering the scattered remnants of his father's army. And you know what? While most nobles were busy saving their own skin, he was out there recruiting soldiers, collecting supplies,
and planning a counterattack that everyone told him was absolute suicide. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but honestly, it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. He knew he couldn't match the Mongols in numbers or conventional warfare, so he decided to use Afghanistan's mountainous terrain to his advantage. The young prince had studied the Mongol military system obsessively, and he understood their greatest weakness. They were most vulnerable when fighting in difficult terrain where their cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively. By early 1221, Jalal ad-Din had assembled a force of around 60,000 men, a mixture of Khwarezmian survivors, Afghan tribesmen, and mercenaries. Now, what made this army special wasn't its size, but its composition. These weren't pampered palace guards or reluctant conscripts. These were hardened fighters who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Jalal ad-Din spent months training them in guerrilla tactics, teaching them to use the rocky terrain of Afghanistan as both shield and weapon. But the Mongols were already closing in, and everyone knew that a confrontation was inevitable. Then in March 1221, it happened. A Mongol force led by generals Shigi Kutuk and Jalal Noyan marched into the Parwan Valley, confident they would crush this upstart prince just like they had crushed every other opponent. They had approximately 30,000 seasoned Mongol warriors, veterans of campaigns across Asia who had never tasted defeat. Little did they know that Jalal ad-Din had been waiting for exactly this moment, and he had prepared a trap that would absolutely shock the world. The Battle of Parwan began like most Mongol victories, with a devastating cavalry charge designed to break enemy morale and scatter their forces. But here's the thing. Jalal ad-Din had positioned his troops on elevated ground, using the rocky slopes to neutralize the Mongol horses' advantage. As the enemy charged up the steep terrain, they found themselves exposed and vulnerable, their formation breaking apart on the uneven ground. And that's when Jalal ad-Din made the move that would earn him a place in military history. He personally led a countercharge directly into the heart of the Mongol formation. Picture this: a 22-year-old prince, outnumbered and fighting for the survival of his people, charging headfirst into what was considered the most feared army in the world. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Here was their enemy, someone they expected to cower and flee, instead meeting them head-on with a ferocity that matched their own. Jalal ad-Din's sword cut through Mongol ranks like they were made of paper, and his presence on the battlefield inspired his men to fight with supernatural courage. For the first time in their lives, Mongol warriors found themselves retreating, their legendary discipline crumbling under the relentless assault. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome became clear as the sun began to set. The Mongol force was in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. Jalal ad-Din had achieved the impossible. He had defeated a Mongol army in open battle. News of the victory spread like wildfire across the Islamic world, and suddenly this forgotten prince became a symbol of hope for everyone living under the Mongol threat. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't just a military victory. This was a psychological earthquake that shook the very foundation of Mongol invincibility. What the Mongols didn't realize was that Parwan would have consequences far beyond a single battlefield. Within months, rebellions erupted in cities across the Mongol Empire. People who had accepted Mongol rule suddenly began to believe that resistance was possible. The victory inspired insurgency groups from Afghanistan to Persia, and Genghis Khan found himself dealing with threats he had never faced before. Reports suggest that the great Khan himself was deeply disturbed by news of the defeat, recognizing that Jalal ad-Din represented a new kind of enemy, one who combined tactical brilliance with absolute fearlessness. For Jalal ad-Din, the victory at Parwan should have been the beginning of a great reconquest. He now had credibility, a battle-tested army, and the support of populations across the region. But here's the thing. Success had also made him the Mongols' primary target. And when I say target, I mean the target. Genghis Khan personally took command of the campaign against him, bringing the full weight of the Mongol war machine to bear on this troublesome prince. Little did Jalal ad-Din know that his greatest victory would also seal his ultimate fate. Now, the Mongol response was swift and overwhelming. I mean, we're talking about Genghis Khan here, The man didn't mess around. He assembled a massive force and pursued Jalal ad-Din relentlessly across Afghanistan and into the Punjab. But unlike those overconfident generals at Parwan, the great Khan understood exactly what kind of opponent he was facing. This wasn't some amateur. This was strategic warfare at its finest. He used his superior numbers and logistics to gradually wear down Jalal ad-Din's forces, avoiding pitched battles and instead focusing on cutting off supplies and escape routes. It was honestly a masterclass in strategic warfare, and even Jalal ad-Din's tactical genius couldn't overcome such overwhelming odds indefinitely. The end came at the Battle of the Indus River in 1221. Picture this: cornered against the riverbank with nowhere to retreat, Jalal ad-Din made his final stand. And even facing certain death, he fought with the same fearless intensity that had made him famous. Historical accounts describe him cutting down Mongol warriors, even as his own forces crumbled around him. But numbers eventually told, and as his army was slaughtered, Jalal ad-Din made a decision that would become absolutely legendary. Rather than surrender, he spurred his horse off a cliff into the Indus River below. Now get this, the sight was so dramatic that even Genghis Khan himself was moved to respect. Can you imagine? Historical sources record that the great Khan ordered his archers not to shoot at the fleeing prince, reportedly saying that such a brave man deserved to live. But while Jalal ad-Din survived that day, swimming across the river to safety, his power was broken. He spent the next few years as a fugitive, occasionally gathering small forces to continue his resistance, but he never again posed a serious threat to Mongol expansion. He was eventually killed in 1231, but by then he had already earned his place in history as the man who proved that even Genghis Khan could be defeated. What's really fascinating, though, is how this story reveals something fundamental about both power and human nature. Jalal ad-Din's brief moment of triumph at Parwan showed that even the most seemingly invincible forces have weaknesses, but it also demonstrated the brutal reality that individual brilliance, no matter how exceptional, cannot overcome systemic advantages indefinitely. The Mongols didn't just have better warriors, they had better organization, better logistics, and most importantly, better adaptability. When they lost at Parwan, they learned from their mistakes and came back stronger. That's what made them so terrifying. But here's what really gets me. The people who suffered most were the ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire of this epic conflict. Cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, and entire regions were depopulated by the warfare between Jalal ad-Din and the Mongols. I mean, we're talking about millions of lives here. What is clear is that this period was a perfect example of how individual ambition and imperial conflicts can devastate the lives of countless innocent people. But it's also a reminder that sometimes, even hopeless resistance can serve a purpose, by proving that the impossible is occasionally possible. The legacy of Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu extends far beyond his military achievements. He became a symbol of resistance against impossible odds, inspiring countless stories and legends throughout the Islamic world. His victory at Parwan proved that the Mongol Empire, despite its overwhelming power, was not invincible. And that's huge. This lesson would be remembered by later generals and rulers who faced similar challenges, showing them that strategic thinking and tactical innovation could sometimes overcome even the greatest disadvantages. Reports suggest that towards the end, Jalal ad-Din had gone from a hopeful young prince to a desperate fugitive, but he never lost the courage that had made him famous. Modern historians recognize him as one of the most underrated military commanders in history, and I mean seriously underrated. A man whose brief moment of glory had consequences that echoed across centuries. His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, someone willing to stand up against impossible odds can sometimes achieve the impossible. Now, whilst the story of Jalal ad-Din is pretty incredible, I still wouldn't call him the most fascinating forgotten figure from this period. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely mind-blowing story of the man who actually convinced Genghis Khan to spare an entire civilization. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.